Hi, I'm Chris Bournet. Having directed the documentary Lady Wrestler, which chronicles trailblazing African American women who integrated pro wrestling in the 1950s, I'm really interested in other trailblazing figures. So, a friend of mine, Kirk Kirk, forgive me for mispronouncing your last name, but he has written a book, co authored the autobiography of the late wrestling legend, Mexican American wrestling legend, Chavo Guerrero. I hope I'm saying that right. Chavo Guerrero. I guess that's the Anglo way of saying it. But instant classic. I'm really looking forward to reading it. And so this is an interview with Kirk in which he talks about how he got involved in co-authoring the book with Chavo, obviously before he passed away, and the insights he learned about Chavo's legacy. So I hope you enjoy this interview.
So great job on the book. Instant classic. So yeah, my first question is, how did you come up with the title, Instant Classic?
I'd love to say that I did, but I didn't. There's the first person I've got to put over is Kenny Casanova, because when I finally decided to get everything going, because Chavo had already passed away, and I was waiting for permission from the family, and I was trying to figure out how to even do this because I didn't know. And so I reached out to a guy named Kenny Casanova, who had put out a lot of other books for other pro wrestlers. And it was his idea. He came up with that because he said, just come up with something a little bit different. And Chavo had competed most recently, that a lot of people remember him as in the WWE as Chavo Guerrero, as Chavo Classic, because Chavo, his son Chavo Jr., was using that name, and he just actually loved the name Classic. So he kind of started going by Classic in his later life anyway. And he kind of was an instant classic. If you sort of saw him in the ring right away, he was one of those few guys who just got it right away. I think it helped too. He was from part of the Guerrero wrestling family. I mean, his dad was a legend in Mexico.
Yeah, and that's definitely one reason why I thought his story was interesting, because similar to the women I interviewed for the Lady Wrestler documentary, wrestling, was kind of a family business. So I thought that was really interesting. Mm-hmm. So, what was the writing process for the book? Were you guys in the same location, or were you working through email, or how did you do it?
I interviewed him for my website. Can I do a shameless plug?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, notinhalloffame.com. And he liked the piece I did on him. And then 2 weeks later, he called me up and said, can you help me with my autobiography? And I'd never done that before. I said, yeah. And so we spoke, I don't know how many times. And then I started writing things. And as I would write something, I would send it to him. So we do 2-hour writing sessions or audio sessions. And I'm going through things that I thought were interesting. Some things about his career I knew, some things I had no clue about. A lot of it I didn't. But I wanted to meet him. So, because he was in a place called Bandera, which is an hour west of San Antonio. And I was living near Toronto at the time. So I flew down there to just try and get a bigger idea of who he is, what he was, how far we could go. Because there was a lot of things that happened in his life that maybe he didn't want to admit to, but he did.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a very hands-on process for him. I know that in doing some research from other wrestler autobiographies, they don't do much. I shouldn't say all of them. I mean, that's certainly not the case. Like Mick Foley, for example, actually wrote all his, didn't have a ghostwriter. But Ric Flair said he was misquoted in
his own autobiography.
Yeah, I think Dennis Rodman was another person who said the same thing, but I certainly didn't want to go that route. I wanted to make sure that this didn't happen. So yeah, it was a very hands-on process for him, because he's other than the actual last chapter, he approved everything.
So did you just sort of, after you did that initial meeting, you just continued to talk to him over the phone, or?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we just try to do it chronologically. I mean, there were some issues because he'd remember stories, but he would occasionally, I think, misremember when it happened.
Okay.
So a lot of wrestling before 1984 isn't, you can't really find much of it on YouTube, mostly because the masters are all gone. the companies that would tape them all locally would they tape over their existing master footage. So I had to do a bunch of research just to get as much chronological data of everything I could find. So just doing a lot of research from other websites that had already done that. And so it reached a point where I emailed him, okay, this is where you were in, let's say, 1981, 82, 83. And that way we would sort of like could go from there. And as he's doing that, he just lay out gems that I don't think he even knew were worth discussing.
Like, can you give an example?
Yeah. I don't think he was going to go into too much detail about when he was in a movie. He was in a movie with Henry Winkler.
Yeah, I saw that in his bio. Yeah.
Yeah. So a wrestling movie called The One and Only. And in that movie, Chavo, Henry Winkler plays an actor who can't get work, so he becomes a wrestler. And as he's sort of progressing in that, the first person he wrestles is Chavo, who's playing a character called Indian Joe. So I get him to more open up about that whole thing. So I didn't even have any lines. He said, okay, yeah, but you're the only guy in the 70s to beat up the Fonz. That's something. So we went on more about that. Then other stories where he met then he would go into one thing. Oh yeah, and then I partied with John Holmes, like the famous porn star. Then he moved on, like, okay, wait, oh no, whoa, let's go back. That he used to do, just how extraordinary it was, because when he was on top for the first part of his career, that was from 75 to 79, and that was in Los Angeles. So he was intermixing with a lot of celebrities that most of us would never even think of.
Right. Yeah, so not to keep plugging my own projects, but I collaborated on someone's autobiography called All Jokes Aside with Raymond Lambert about the comedy club he started. And one of the challenges was writing in Raymond's voice. Did you find that a challenge at all?
Yes.
With Chavo?
Yeah, I struggled with it the entire time because honestly, I don't know that I did, but that's how he wanted it. So, because he was 25 years older than me. I said it to him, so I can say that here. And he talked like Cheech, like from Cheech and Chong. So I'm not using the slang that he would normally use. And I said, like, I'm worried that I'm not actually saying it the way you would say it. So like, you're saying it exactly how I would want to say it. Like, okay. So yeah, I worried about that all the time. But he was fine with how I was writing it. So yes, I was totally worried about that. But he kept saying over and over, you're doing fine. So I had to take him on his word for that.
Cool. And because I haven't finished reading the book yet, but in doing a little bit of research on Chavo before we did this interview, I was struck by how almost no information mentioned his ethnicity. It just said he is an American wrestler. That's what his Wikipedia and several wrestling sites described him that way. With the Black women that I interviewed for Lady Wrestler, they could not escape being Black and they could not escape being a woman. But how in touch or how much of how prominent was Chavo's Mexican heritage in his life, if at all?
Everything to him. Yeah, he was very proud to be a Mexican American. He was actually born in Mexico, and his father made sure that he was actually born in Mexico because he was going back and forth because his father at the time was wrestling in both Texas and Mexico on a regular basis. So he wanted most of his kids were born in Mexico, I think, except for the last one, I believe. I have to reread my book. But yeah. But yeah, they were all raised in the US, but born in Mexico. And so he was very proud of his Hispanic heritage.
Was he, did he consider himself like a trailblazer as like one of the few Latino wrestlers, or was he aware of that?
Not as much as he should have.
Okay.
I mean, he definitely should have, because like I think why he didn't as much is because where he got big in Southern California, there were a lot more Hispanic wrestlers competing. Whereas, and you and I sort of talked about that because we have sort of a similar pop culture background as it goes. So I don't know if you watched wrestling as a kid, but like when did you?
Well, I watched the WWF with Roddy Piper and
Okay,
Hogan. Yeah.
right. So I mean, that's what I grew up on.
Yeah.
So there was basically in that federation, you had room for either 2 or 3 African Americans, and that was it. Two Hispanics, that was it. So when Chavo actually got there in '87, he never made television, and he said, I know that it was because Tito Santana was there.
Okay.
So they weren't going. They didn't think at the time that they could appeal that
The
basically
mainstream
non-white
audience.
wrestlers. Yeah, even though there was evidence that showed that they already did. Junkyard Dog, Tito Santana, they appealed to everybody.
Yeah, and wrestling was so huge in Mexico. I don't get the mindset that they couldn't appeal to everybody. But did Chavo ever talk about any incidents where he encountered racism or
All the time.
discrimination, or where he had to take a stand and
Yep.
kind of assert himself?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, even like right away from like he dealt with that as a kid, like people he thought would be his friends too, and then they would turn on him pretty quickly. In terms of, yeah, I guess to the original question, in terms of a trailblazer, he didn't really view himself that way, but he was. In
Mhm.
terms of racial discrimination, yeah, absolutely. He fought that all the time.
In the industry, I'm talking
Yeah.
about specifically in the industry.
Yeah, in the industry, not as much as you'd think he would, but in the WWF when he got there, yeah, because he never got an opportunity. He was under contract and they never used him. And mainly for the reason that we sort of discussed. Whereas like in California and LA, that wasn't an issue at all because most of their demographic was 90% Hispanic.
Yeah.
When he was wrestling in Florida, sort of it was again a high Hispanic population, even though in New York it was a high Puerto Rican. So, but he wasn't that. So that was stuff that he went through. One person that he didn't want to wrestle for, but he wound up wrestling for anyway, was because he heard all these stories, was Bill Watts in Oklahoma. And Bill Watts, it's an interesting character because if you look at people who worked for him, they'll either say that he was one of the biggest racists or he's one of the biggest non-racists because of who he gave opportunities for. Bill Watts was that guy who just said, well, if somebody's going to make me money, I don't care what you look like. So he was the first guy, not the first, but they put Junkyard Dog on top before Vince sort of took him. He said, like, if I'm looking at all sports, if I'm looking at baseball, football, and basketball, it's dominated by African Americans. Does it not make sense that this would happen in pro wrestling when they're large men too? So he had like Junkyard Dog versus Butch Reed at the top when a lot of the other promotions weren't doing that. But Bill was also the type of guy who would say exactly what he thought, which can be considered as, he got fired actually from WCW because he actually said in an interview that if he owned a business, he should be allowed to discriminate and not allow people of certain colors to go in. He never actually used that business practice, but to actually say that, that's why he got that reputation. But Chavo didn't want to go there. He had to be begged to work there. So it's sort of the opposite sort of way, but he faced other prejudice actually because of his name. Because people say, well, you're only here because your dad was a star. So he had to fight through that and then prove stuff on his own. But yeah, I mean, with Bill Watts, it was interesting because I definitely wanted to stake on that. Actually, Bill wrote one of the forewords.
Oh, wow.
For this book. So they became, very good friends. And it's an interesting thing. I actually thought there was going to be a lot more that he went through in the wrestling business, but not as much as it did. As well, yeah, WWF, he definitely faced that for sure. But overall, not nearly as much as you'd think.
Yeah, Bill Watts sounds similar to Billy Wolf, the women's wrestling promoter, where he was
Yes!
in some ways ahead of his time, in promoting Black women and in wrestling and being inspired by Jackie Robinson, but in other ways being really, really regressive and almost abusive. So he, just as Billy Wolf was really complicated, it sounds like Bill Watts was kind of similar.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a perfect example. Yeah, I didn't think of that, but yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. So what were some of the things about Chavo's life and career that you didn't know about that you found out by interviewing him and working on the book?
I wasn't aware because he didn't work with him that often. I wasn't aware how big Andre the Giant was in his life. So we dedicated a whole chapter just to his friendship with Andre, and just some of the stories that he was taught that he told of just how Andre sort of helped him. Actually, here is something with the prejudice thing that he dealt with back in Los Angeles. So Andre would come in periodically to work just battle royals here and there. And there was this one wrestler, white wrestler, who was picking on Chavo for. He said, "Well, you shouldn't be on top. You're only there because of your ethnicity, playing towards that crowd." Not and Chavo could outwork this, and then Chavo lost, and he said, "Okay, well, we're gonna finally settle this." Andre made sure to that he said made sure no one else interfered, and Chavo knocked the guy out, and Chavo comes, "Thanks, bosses. I knew you had it." So just like things like that, or just like when they actually had to wrestle each other in Japan in this tournament. So Andre would just Andre sort of like let Chavo get a bit of offense, and then just like right at the end, just dropped down and farted on him because he could. But yeah, just because Andre, everything I've ever read about the guy. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, there's another example of the racism that he dealt with. He always felt that it would be really, I think it's not subconscious because you can't say that because it was open, because they'd say everything they wanted. But like Dusty Rhodes, who recently passed not that long ago, was one where he said, like, if I had a nickel every time I heard him use the N-word, I'd never have to work again.
Wow.
Which it's sort of an interest because a lot of people don't talk that way about Dusty right now, but that's things he went through. He talked a lot about Hulk Hogan, who had his trouble because of what he said, and said he never saw that with Hulk, but he's not exactly surprised either, based on the people he hung out with. We saw
Right,
more of
right.
that from Paul Warndorf, who also recently passed. So he details an altercation he had with him because he felt that Paul was being disrespectful. This was on a tour of Japan towards the Japanese people. Said, like, basically, what are you doing? They're here. They're paying to see us, and you're knocking them like this.
Right, right. So I saw that Roddy Piper wrote
Yes.
sort of a would you call it a forward? It's on the back of the book, right?
Well, it's on both.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I had to put something on the back, so we put that because it's Roddy.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, but they sort of had a rivalry in the ring.
Oh, yeah.
They were friends outside of the ring. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Actually, Piper credits Chavo with teaching him how to wrestle.
Okay.
Yeah, because they had a 2-year feud in Los Angeles that tore everything down, and they remained friends forever, mainly because Piper got a chance to go work in Portland, which wound up being the city that he fell in love with and stayed. That would be his home base for the rest of his life. And the man who was running Los Angeles said, like, well, where's Roddy going? Chavo kept his mouth shut. He never said. And because like in that industry, I don't have to tell you that from, I'm sure, the research you've done, it's
Yeah.
pretty cutthroat. Friends
Yeah.
are few and far between. So when he asked, I was there with him in San Antonio. I remember we were at the Riverwalk, and he played for me the message because when Roddy said he would do the forward, and just hearing Roddy's voice for me, like that was my guy growing up. I wanted to be Piper. I wanted to be either him or Bobby Heenan, the Weasley manager. I thought I would have been good at that.
Right. Was there anything I didn't ask about that's important to mention about Chavo or his legacy?
Not if I could say, like, the thing that I love about Chavo too is he poured it all out here in this book, warts and all. He was fired from a lot of places, and he tells you why. He's open about a lot of his mistakes, and a lot of the time when anyone, regardless of what their profession is, or doing their autobiography, you're hiding from everything you do. He wasn't afraid to say what he did wrong, He was more afraid to do it because he didn't want to besmirch the name Guerrero. Because you asked me before, like, was he proud of his heritage? Yeah, he was. He was proud to be Hispanic. He was proud to be American. More than anything, he was proud to be a Guerrero. That name meant everything to him. And for him to be this open and honest, I mean, it took a lot of soul searching for him to do that. Again, not because he wanted to embarrass himself. He owns everything he did, but he doesn't want anyone to think less of that last name. Just a class guy.
Do you think that he gets the recognition he deserves? Do you think that he's, as you know, wrestling fans now kind of know who he is?
No, not at all. And it's not really WWE's fault either. I mean, he didn't wrestle there that long. It's more just, like I was saying before, the lack of footage out there of what he did. So when you do see old matches from him in the 70s, and I was searching far and wide, I found more because now more people have found more to upload them. He was ahead of his time. He was the first guy to do the moonsault, jumping, like do a back somersault off the top rope. That's something he invented in his mid 30s.
Wow.
So he was doing things that other people weren't. He was a natural in the ring, and most people aren't. I mean, in anything we do, doesn't matter whether it's wrestling, writing, whatever it is. It takes a long time to do that, and there's just not enough footage out there for this. So no, I don't think he gets his proper legacy. Mostly it's because there's just not enough of his footage out there. I mean, anyone who sees what he did would see right away, this guy was a classic, just an instant classic. Final point.
Yeah. I think his life sounds like it would make a great biopic. So hopefully some Robert Rodriguez or somebody you'll hear from them and they'll buy the rights to the book. And
actually, I already know exactly what would make a movie.
What's that?
There's a part even before he became a pro wrestler, when he was just doing it part-time.
Okay.
There was this period where he was a teacher. So he was hired to be the wrestling coach at Burgess or Jefferson, the high school in El Paso. And so he took over, and the team didn't win a meet all last year. They didn't win a meet his first year, but he kicked off all the seniors who were on the team because they didn't really want to be there. So then he started recruiting from other programs, and he developed this core group who were much younger. So they did very poorly in the first year. All the Hispanic kids from the wrong side of the tracks, and he used his connections. So he brought in other existing pro wrestlers. One like Chris Taylor, who just won the Olympics in '72, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, who were amateur wrestlers in Oklahoma and were NWA. Well, Jack was an NWA world champion. I don't know if he was at that point. And just like guest coaches, he took out of his own pocket buying them new mats, new gear. Wow. And when the football coach would disparage them, he actually beat up the football coach. I guess you could do that back then. Can't really do that now.
Right.
Put one in a locker. Actually, the third, because there's actually four forwards in this. One of them is actually from one of his students.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the second year they went 500, and then the third year they won city. But to win city, Chavo's star pupil had to beat Chavo's own brother, who's competing at the other school, and they won. And then afterwards, it was just sort of like this kumbaya moment with the family. It's like, and he said to his brother, Hector, I'm sorry. He says, no, cabron, you did what you had to do. That's a Disney movie.
Yeah, totally. I totally see that as like a Latino, like Remember the Titans.
Exactly. Yeah. Something like that, with a bit of Lean on Me, that scene where he kicks everybody out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Throw in some Stand and Deliver. And that one, I think that right there it's based on a true story. It's all about, making these kids believe in themselves. And I talked to a couple of them, and they said that to me.
Well, Kirk, get busy writing the script and pitching it.
Sounds good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I definitely recommend checking out Instant Classic. So great job again on the book.
Thank you.
Cool.